She had one silver coin left. 1. The ranch was bleeding out around her, the livestock down to 11 head, her husband 3 months in the ground with debts she never knew existed, and her belly so swollen she could barely pull on her boots. Harper Wren stood in the middle of her kitchen at 4 in the morning and looked at that coin on the table like it was a verdict. Most women would have packed what they could carry and walked away. Harper picked up the coin, put it in her coat pocket, and walked out into the dark instead, straight toward the hardest decision of her life. If this story moves you, hit that like button and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. She had been awake since 2, not because of the cold, though the cold was bad enough. The kind that got into the walls of the old Wren ranch house like a slow sickness, working through every crack and gap that Thomas had promised to fix before the first snowfall and never did. Not because of the baby either, though the baby was making its presence known with the particular viciousness that had been her companion for the past 7 months, sharp little kicks landing in places that made her breath catch. She'd been awake because of the ledger. Thomas Wren's ledger. The one she hadn't known existed until his brother Calvin showed up at the funeral with a face like a man about to deliver a sentence, pressed it into her hands, and said, "You're going to need to look at this before the bank does." Harper had looked at it. She'd been looking at it, on and off, for 3 months. The numbers didn't change no matter how long she stared at them. Thomas had borrowed against the ranch 3 separate times. Once for cattle she knew about, once for equipment she thought had been paid off, and once for something Calvin referred to vaguely as an investment in a timber operation up north that had apparently yielded nothing but a handshake and a dead end. The total outstanding was a number that had made her sit down hard on the kitchen floor the first time she saw it, her back against the cabinet, one hand flat on her belly, staring at the ceiling until the lamp burned low. $1,142. In November of 1883, on a failing Montana ranch with 11 head of cattle, a collapsing hay barn, and no male labor, $1,142 might as well have been $11,000. She got up from the kitchen table at 4:15, left the ledger where it was, and put water on for coffee. The stove was working. That was something. Thomas had at least kept the stove in decent shape. She stood close to it and pressed her palms against her lower back, which had been aching something fierce for 2 days, and looked out the window above the sink at the black Montana sky. The stars were out. That was the only mercy. When the sky was clear this time of year, it meant the next storm hadn't come in yet. You could plan around a clear sky. You could count what you had, figure what you needed, and make a decision before the next wall of white came rolling down from the north and took your options away. Harper Wren had been making decisions by herself for 3 months. She was 31 years old. She'd come to Montana from Missouri at 24 as Thomas's wife, confident in her own capabilities and mostly right about that confidence. She could work. She knew how to work. Harder than Thomas in most respects, though she'd never said that out loud while he was living. She knew livestock, knew a fair amount about soil and weather, could do sums in her head faster than most men she'd met. What she didn't have was a body that could do what a ranch this size required, not with a baby 6 weeks from arrival and getting heavier every day. And she didn't have money. And she didn't have time. The coffee came up. She poured it and sat back down at the table with the ledger. The remaining silver coin was sitting next to the ink pot. 1 coin. She'd found it in Thomas's coat pocket when she'd finally brought herself to go through his things in October. An 1879 Morgan dollar, worn smooth on the edges. She didn't know why she'd kept it separate from the small cash envelope in the drawer, maybe because it felt like something deliberate, a coin he'd been carrying, touching. Maybe because it was the only thing she'd found in his pockets that didn't tell a story she didn't want to know. She picked it up now and held it in her palm. 11 cattle, 2 horses, 1 too old for hard work, a hay supply that would last, if she rationed it hard, until February. 3 pigs, the chickens, which at least kept producing with some consistency. A root cellar stocked reasonably well from the summer garden, which she'd worked herself through August when her back would allow it, and Thomas had already been too sick to do much more than supervise from the porch. A well that was still giving clean water. The ranch house itself, which was structurally sound if drafty, and the barn, which was not structurally sound in the north corner and was increasingly not. That was what she had. What she needed was labor. Specifically, she needed someone who could do the physical work that the ranch required to survive the winter. Hauling hay, checking fence lines in the snow, managing the cattle through cold snaps, handling the barn repairs before the whole north wall went down. She needed someone capable. The problem was that capable labor cost money she didn't have. Hiring even a single ranch hand for a winter season would eat through what little cash she had left and still not cover the work. And there was nobody left in the area who owed her a favor significant enough to cover 3 months of unpaid winter labor. She'd gone through everyone she knew. She'd been going through everyone she knew for weeks, the way you run your tongue over a sore tooth, knowing it's going to hurt, doing it anyway, hoping something has changed. Nothing had changed. Which brought her back to the idea that had been sitting at the edge of her thinking for 2 weeks like something she was afraid to look at directly. The orphan station. There was a receiving station in Mill Haven, 12 miles east, that had been operating for about 4 years as part of the broader network of child placement programs that moved orphaned and abandoned children from the crowded eastern cities out into Western Territory households. Harper knew about it the way she knew about most things in the county, through conversation, through the kind of information that passed between women at the general store and after church services. She knew that families took in children from the station in exchange for household help, farm work, that kind of arrangement. She knew some of those arrangements were exploitative and some were genuine, and most were somewhere in the complicated middle. She also knew that the children who came through that station were by and large desperate, which was a feeling she understood right now with some intimacy. The idea sat badly with her in certain ways. She wasn't naive about what it looked like. A widow, pregnant, showing up at an orphan station and asking for a child who could work. She wasn't naive about the ways that arrangement could go wrong, the ways it could be cruel without meaning to be, the ways need and desperation could turn good intentions into something ugly. She had thought about that. She had thought about little else for 2 weeks. But she had also thought about this. She had a house. She had food. Enough food to last through winter if they were careful. She had warmth, or the means to make warmth. She had a functioning ranch that, with enough labor, could survive this season and possibly turn itself around. What she needed was help. What the station had was children who needed a place. It wasn't charity in either direction. It was a trade. She just had to be honest about what the trade was. Harper put the coin back on the table, finished her coffee, and looked at the kitchen around her. The dishes were clean and stacked. The floor was swept. The curtains, blue cotton, faded from years of morning light, were the same curtains she'd hung the first month she'd arrived on this property, when everything still felt possible and Thomas had been standing in the doorway watching her hang them with that particular look he had, the good one, the one she hadn't seen enough of toward the end. She got up, rinsed her coffee cup, and started pulling on her outside clothes. If she was going to drive 12 miles to Mill Haven and back before the next cold front moved in, she needed to leave before sunrise. The road to Mill Haven was rough under a thin skin of overnight ice that made the wagon drift on the downhill stretches and the horse, the younger one, whose name was Birch, nervous and short-stepping. Harper held the reins loose and let Birch find his own footing, which he was better at than being corrected. Thomas had taught her that, at least. Let a horse figure out the bad ground himself. He's got 4 feet, and you've got 2. Trust the arithmetic. She reached Mill Haven a little after 8 in the morning. The town was alive with the particular cold morning energy of a frontier settlement in November. Smoke coming from every chimney, the sound of a hammer somewhere from the direction of the livery. 2 women in heavy coats moving fast across the frozen mud of the main street. Harper tied Birch to the post outside the general store, checked the time on the clock in the window, 8:14, and walked 3 blocks east to the building she'd asked about once, a year ago, out of nothing more than general knowledge. The orphan station was a converted house, 2 stories, white paint going gray at the edges. A hand-lettered sign above the door said, Mill Haven Placement Office, Children's Aid. There were no children visible outside. A wisp of smoke came from the chimney. Harper stood on the walk for a moment, her hands in her coat pockets, and breathed. Then she walked up the steps and knocked. What? The woman who ran the station was named Mrs. Aldous, Della Aldous, 50s, sharp-eyed, behind small, round spectacles, with the manner of someone who had seen every kind of person walk through her door and had learned exactly how to read them in the first 30 seconds. She looked at Harper the way a doctor looks at a patient, not unkindly, but without softness either. Come in, she said. You look like you've been traveling. 12 miles, Harper said. My name is Harper Wren. I have a ranch east of here, about 12 miles on the Danner Road. My husband passed in August. Mrs. Aldis's expression shifted in the way expressions do when someone receives information they were half expecting. I'm sorry for that, she said, in the practiced tone of someone who meant it, but had said it many times. Thank you. Harper sat down in the chair the woman gestured to, across a desk that was covered in neat stacks of papers and a ledger considerably thicker than Thomas's. I'm going to be direct with you about why I'm here, because I think you'd see through anything less than direct. I generally do, Mrs. Aldis said. I need help on the ranch through the winter. I can't afford to hire it. I have a baby due in late December, and I can't do the physical work alone. Harper paused. I'm not here looking for a servant. I'm here because I understand that the children who come through this station need placement, and I have a house that is warm and food that is adequate, and a working ranch that, if this winter goes reasonably, has a future. I want to be honest about what I'm offering and what I need. I think that's more respectful than dressing it up. Mrs. Aldis studied her for a long moment. The clock on the wall ticked. How old are you? The woman asked. 31. And the ranch? What's its current situation? Harper told her. All of it. The debts, the cattle count, the barn, the baby, the one silver coin she'd left on the kitchen table. She didn't exaggerate in either direction. When she was done, Mrs. Aldis had written several things in a small notebook and was looking at her with an expression that was harder to read than the first one. I appreciate the honesty, the woman said finally. We get people in here who talk about providing a home, and what they mean is they need a free farmhand and they want me to hand them a 10-year-old. You're not pretending it's anything other than a work arrangement, which is… She stopped, seemed to weigh something. Refreshing in its way. I'm also not pretending it won't become more than that, Harper said. I've thought about this a fair amount. If someone is going to live in my house and we're going to get through a Montana winter together, it's going to become more than a work arrangement whether either of us wants it to or not. I'm prepared for that. I just don't want to start with a lie. Mrs. Aldis took off her spectacles and rubbed the bridge of her nose. There are two I want to show you, she said. They were in the back sitting room, a long, narrow space with two small windows and a braided rug that had seen better decades. A boy was sitting on the wooden bench along the wall, elbows on his knees, staring at the middle distance with the particular blankness of someone who has learned not to get their face ready for things too early. Beside him, pressed close to his arm but not touching it, a girl sat with her feet dangling above the floor, a piece of string looped between her fingers that she was working into a slow pattern. The boy looked up when they came in. He was 16, or close to it, Harper guessed right around there. Tall but still growing into his height, with dark hair that had been cut recently and badly, and a face that was older than it should have been. Not hardened exactly. More like settled. The way a face gets when the person wearing it has decided to stop reacting to things and start calculating them instead. The girl didn't look up right away. She kept working her string. Jace, Mrs. Aldis said, this is Mrs. Wren. She has a ranch east of town. The boy looked at Harper. His eyes moved in a way that was quick and specific, taking in her coat, her hands, the state of her boots, the shape of her belly under the wool. Not rude, assessing it. How many cattle? He said. Harper blinked. 11 head. What kind? Herefords, mostly. 2 longhorn crosses. He nodded, once, like she'd answered a question on a test. What's your hay situation? Enough through February if I ration. The barn's got problems in the north corner. Structural. Needs work before it gets worse. Jace looked at the floor, then back at her. I can fix a barn corner. Have you done it before? I've done most things before. He said it without arrogance, just flatly, like a statement about weather. Harper looked at the girl, who still hadn't looked up. The string between her small fingers had become something, not quite a figure, but the beginning of a shape. Lila, Mrs. Aldis said gently. The girl looked up. She was 9, and she had the kind of face that took a moment to read because she was doing nothing with it intentionally. No smile, no wariness, just a steady, quiet looking that somehow wasn't uncomfortable. Her eyes were dark and still, and she held Harper's gaze without blinking for a full beat longer than most adults would. Hi, Harper said. Lila looked at her belly, then back at her face. Then she said in a voice that was quieter than Harper had expected, but perfectly clear, "When is the baby coming?" "Late December," Harper said. "Maybe a little sooner." Lila looked at the string in her hands. "I know how to keep a fire going all night," she said, not as a boast, as a fact being entered into evidence. Harper felt something shift in her chest. Not sentiment, or not only that, something more practical, something that said these two. She looked at Mrs. Aldous. "I'll need to know their full situation," Harper said. "I'm not taking in children without knowing what they're coming from." "Sit down," Mrs. Aldous said. "This will take a few minutes." The Mercer children, Jace 16 and Lila 9, had come through the Eastern Processing Station 8 months ago and had been at the Millhaven facility since spring, which was longer than most placements lasted. They'd been passed over 3 times, once by a farming family who'd decided they wanted a single older boy and not the girl. Once by a couple who'd taken Jace for a trial week and returned him after he'd argued with the husband about a fence repair method and turned out to be right. Once by a woman who'd wanted a younger child for domestic companionship, and Lila had apparently looked at her with that unblinking stare, and the woman had found it unsettling. Their mother had died of fever in New York City the previous January. Their father had been gone since Lila was 4. Whereabouts unknown, probably dead, possibly not. They had no other family that could be confirmed. They had been, before the mother's death, living in a tenement in the lower part of the city, which meant they knew cold and close quarters and scarcity in ways that were different from frontier scarcity but not entirely unrelated. Jace had been working since he was 12. Different things, docks, warehouses, whatever would pay. He had, Mrs. Aldous noted with a particular kind of emphasis, some instinct for mechanical problems, for figuring out how things worked and what was broken and how to fix them. He had been difficult for placements not because he was violent or unstable, but because he had opinions and the intelligence to back them up, and some people found that uncomfortable in a 16-year-old boy who was supposed to be grateful and quiet. Lila hadn't spoken for the first 2 months after arriving at the station. She'd been diagnosed as possibly simple, possibly traumatized, possibly some combination. Then one day she'd started talking again, to Jace first, and then slowly to others, in that quiet, clear voice, and it became apparent that she'd just been deciding whether it was worth it. She had a way with animals. The station kept a small goat pen and 2 cats, and within 3 days of arriving, Lila had established herself as their primary caretaker without anyone asking her to. She was also, Mrs. Aldous mentioned, the child who noticed things. When a roof shingle had started to go in September, Lila had told her before the first rain. "They're together," Mrs. Aldous said, looking at Harper steadily. "I won't place them separately, and I won't consider requests that require it. If you take one, you take both." "I know," Harper said. "You knew before you came in?" "I figured." Harper folded her hands on the desk. "I have 2 bedrooms that aren't mine. Room enough. And I think 2 of them is probably more honest about what the winter's going to require anyway." Mrs. Aldous studied her again. "You understand this isn't a temporary situation if it goes well. These children have had enough temporary." "I understand that." "And your financial situation is difficult but not hopeless," Harper said. "If I can get through this winter with enough labor to keep the herd alive and the infrastructure from collapsing, the ranch has a real future. I believe that. I wouldn't be sitting here if I didn't believe it." A long silence. The clock. Mrs. Aldous put her spectacles back on. "I'll need to do a visit within the first 2 weeks," she said. "See the property, the living conditions? You're welcome any time. The arrangement will be formalized, written, signed, both parties. You'll receive them as wards with responsibility for their welfare clear and documented." She paused. "And Mrs. Wren, the moment I see anything that tells me those children are being used rather than cared for, I will remove them. I want to be direct about that the same way you were direct with me." "That's fair," Harper said. "It's exactly what I'd want you to say." Time out. They left Millhaven at 10:30. Jace rode in the wagon bed with their bags. 2 small bags between them, which was everything they owned. Lila sat up on the bench beside Harper, which Harper hadn't anticipated, and held the edge of the seat with both hands as Birch found his footing on the icy road. Nobody said much for the first mile or 2. Then Jace said from behind them, "The north corner of the barn. Is it the post or the beam? I think the post, Harper said. There's rot at the base, but I haven't been able to get close enough to be sure that the footing's dangerous and I can't risk a fall. She heard him shift in the wagon bed. I'll look at it today. It's already afternoon, the light. I know how to work by lantern light. Harper glanced sideways at Lila, who was looking at the snow-patched hills rolling past on either side of the road with the expression of someone doing math. Have you been in Montana before? Harper asked her. Lila shook her head. It's different from what you're used to, I imagine. Bigger, Lila said. Yes. More sky. Yes. Another silence. Then Lila said, The baby. Does it have a name yet? Not yet. Harper hadn't let herself think too hard about names. It had felt like counting chickens. Do you have a suggestion? Lila considered this seriously, which Harper appreciated. Not yet, she said finally. I need to see her first. Her? Lila looked at her with that direct gaze. It's a girl, she said, with the certainty of someone who doesn't usually bother saying things they're not sure of. Harper looked back at the road. Something she hadn't expected was happening in her chest. Not grief, not quite hope, not quite either. Something in between them. The ranch looked worse from the outside than Harper had been allowing herself to see. She saw it fresh now, through arriving eyes. The listing barn, the fence line along the east pasture that needed posts replaced, the weathered state of the house itself, boards gone gray from season after season of Montana wind, and no fresh paint and no time. The property had the look of something that had been declining gradually for long enough that the people living in it had stopped being able to see the decline clearly. Jace got down from the wagon before it had fully stopped and stood in the yard looking at the barn with his head tilted slightly, the way a person looks at a problem they're already solving. Harper climbed down, carefully, one hand on the wagon frame, and watched him. Jace, she said. He turned. I want to set something clear before we start. He waited, face neutral. I'm not going to pretend this is a normal household because it isn't. You know why you're here? I know why you're here. What I'm asking from you, I know, is a lot. She kept her voice even. I'm also going to tell you that what you do here matters, and I'm going to say that out loud, which is something you might not be used to hearing. He looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted in his face. Not dramatically, just a small recalibration, a slight loosening around the jaw. What do I call you? He said. Harper's fine. He nodded, looked back at the barn. I'm going to need a pry bar and a hand lamp, he said. Toolboxes in the small shed left of the door, lamps hanging inside the barn entrance. He was already moving. Lila appeared at Harper's elbow, which was slightly startling. She moved quietly. Should I do the chickens? Lila asked. Harper looked down at her. You know chickens? I know animals, Lila said. Harper thought of what Mrs. Aldous had said about the goat pen, the cats. Feeds in the bin by the back door, scatter it in the run and check the nesting boxes, collect whatever's there and bring them inside. Lila was already walking toward the back of the house before Harper finished the sentence. Harper stood in the yard for a moment, alone. The wind moved through the bare cottonwoods along the creek bed. The sky was still clear, that mercy still holding. She put her hand on her belly, where the baby had been quiet most of the morning. All right, she said, to no one in particular, to all of it at once. Let's see what we can do. That first evening was quiet in the way that early things are quiet. Carefully, because everyone involved was still measuring the distance between themselves and everyone else. Harper made a stew from the root cellar stores, turnips, dried beans, a good piece of pork that had been in the smokehouse. It wasn't fancy, but it was hot, and there was enough of it. Jace came in from the barn at dark, smelling of sawdust and cold, and reported on the corner situation. It's the post and the beam, he said, sitting down at the table without hesitation, like he'd been sitting at this table for years. The post is gone at the base, needs to come out and be replaced. The beam's cracked, but it'll hold through the season if I brace it right. I can start on it tomorrow if the temperature doesn't drop too hard overnight. What do you need? 2 posts if you have them cut, or timber I can cut down to size. 6-inch spikes. A come-along if you have one. There's timber in this woodlot. Come-along's in the toolbox. Big one, Red handle. He nodded and spooned stew into his mouth. Lila had found a spot at the counter rather than the table, eating standing up with the bowl in both hands, watching the room with those steady eyes. She'd come in with 7 eggs from the chickens, which Harper noted was more than she'd been getting on her own, which meant Lila had found the nests Harper had missed. "You can sit at the table," Harper said. "I know," Lila said. She didn't move. Harper let it go. Some things needed to be arrived at in their own time. After supper, Harper did the dishes and Jace sat at the table with a piece of paper, doing something with numbers that appeared to be a materials list. Lila had disappeared into the room Harper had said was hers, the smaller one upstairs that had been a sewing room before it was cleared, and when Harper checked quietly, she was already asleep, curled small on the narrow bed, fully clothed, one hand tucked under her cheek. Harper stood in the doorway for a moment. She felt the baby move, a slow roll, the kind that was becoming more common as the weeks passed. She went back downstairs. Jace was still at the table. "How long have you been looking after her?" Harper asked, sitting down across from him with a cup of hot water she was using as a poor substitute for tea, which she'd run out of last month. Jace looked up from his numbers. "Since she was little," he said. "Our mother worked nights a lot. I was around." "That's a long time." He shrugged. It was a practiced shrug, the kind that means "I know," and I've already thought about that, and I've decided not to spend time on it. "She's going to be okay here," Harper said. "I mean that. Both of you." He looked at her with those calculating eyes. "What happens if the bank forecloses?" he said. It wasn't cruel. It was direct. The same way she'd been direct with Mrs. Aldous. He'd earned the same in return. "If the bank forecloses, I'll make sure you have a place to go that isn't back to the station," Harper said. "I'll put that in writing if you want it." He thought about this. "I don't need it in writing," he said. "Then you have my word." Another pause, then, "How much is the debt?" She told him. Jace's jaw moved. He looked down at the paper in front of him, tapped the end of the pencil against it once. "That's a lot," he said. "Yes, but the herd—" He stopped, reorganized his thinking. "If you get through winter with the herd intact, what does spring look like for calving?" Thomas was expecting 3 to 5 calves from the Herefords. "And what does a Hereford calf bring at market?" He wasn't 16 right now. He was something older, something that had been aged quickly by the particular fires that age people quickly. Harper answered him straight, because that was what the question deserved. They sat at the table for another hour, talking through numbers. The baby kicked twice, steadily, making its presence known. The fire in the kitchen stove burned low, and Harper added wood, and it came back up. Outside, the Montana night pressed itself against the windows, cold and vast and indifferent. But inside the kitchen, there was light. And there was something. The beginning of something that didn't have a name yet, or not one that any of them were ready to use. For the first time in 3 months, Harper Wren did not go to bed feeling entirely alone. That was enough. For that night, it was enough. The barn corner got fixed on the 3rd day. It took Jace most of the morning and part of the afternoon, working in cold that hovered around 20 degrees and dropped lower when the wind picked up off the northern flats. Harper watched him from the house twice, not hovering, just checking, and both times he was exactly where he'd said he'd be, doing exactly what he'd said he'd do. He didn't ask for help until he needed the come-along operated while he held the brace in place, and when he called her out, he gave clear instructions and didn't repeat them or slow them down to account for the fact that she was 7 months pregnant and navigating frozen ground. She appreciated that more than she could have explained. "Steady," he said, one hand braced against the new post, the other guiding the beam into position. "Just hold that pull. Don't let it slip back." Harper held the come-along handle with both hands, her boots finding purchase on the packed dirt floor of the barn, her back complaining but manageable. The beam groaned, then it settled. "There," Jace said. He drove the first spike with 4 hits, the second with 5. The angle was bad. The third and fourth went clean. He stepped back, looked at the joint with his head tilted, pressed on the beam with his palm hard enough that Harper expected something to move. Nothing moved. "That'll hold through spring," he said. Harper let out a breath she'd been holding. "Good," she said, "because I don't have the lumber for another attempt." Jace almost smiled. Not quite. It was more like the corners of his mouth considered the option and then moved on. But she caught it, and she filed it away. That was how the first 2 weeks went. Not smoothly. Nothing about that stretch was smooth. The cattle required twice daily attention in the cold, and the Herefords had a particular habit of bunching in the northeast corner of the pasture farthest from the hay station, which meant Jace was walking that distance through snow twice a day to break them loose and push them back toward the feed. He came in each evening with his boots soaked through and said very little about it. Just set the boots near the stove and ate whatever was on the table and went back over his materials list or his rough sketch of the pasture layout that he'd started keeping in a brown paper notebook Harper had given him from Thomas's desk supplies. Lila, in those first 2 weeks, quietly claimed the domestic interior the way water claims low ground, without announcement, without drama, just gradually and completely. By the end of the first week, she had established a routine with the chickens, the pigs, and the 2 horses that was more consistent than anything Harper had managed on her own in the previous 3 months. She had also, without being asked, taken over the task of keeping the kitchen stove fed through the night, which Harper had been doing herself, and which was hard on her sleep and harder still on her back. "You don't have to do that," Harper told her, the first morning she came downstairs to find the kitchen already warm and Lila sitting at the counter with a cup of warm water, watching the window. "I know," Lila said. She kept doing it. Harper tried to understand the girl the same way she'd try to understand a particular piece of land. Not by forcing information from it, but by paying attention to what it showed you without being asked. What Lila showed over those 2 weeks was this. She noticed everything. She said only what she meant, and she had a particular tenderness with living things that expressed itself not as softness, but as precision. She knew how much the horses needed. She knew which of the pigs was off its feed 2 days before it showed any obvious symptoms, and told Harper about it in a matter-of-fact tone that probably saved the animal. She checked on the chickens 3 times a day in cold snaps, and did not need to be told why. What she didn't show, yet, was comfort. She kept herself at a slight remove, not hostile, not unhappy, just not yet arrived. She slept in her room, came down for meals, did her work without complaint. She watched Harper with those steady eyes, and Harper tried to give her something worth watching. Steadiness in return, no sudden moves, no demands for warmth she hadn't offered. It was Jace who broke first, though he'd have argued that word. It was the 14th day, a Sunday, cold enough that the stock work had taken longer than usual and everyone came inside later and more worn down. Harper had made cornbread with the last of the good meal and a soup from dried meat and whatever root vegetables the cellar still had in reasonable shape, which was fewer than she'd been counting on. 2 of the turnip stores had gone bad, and she hadn't caught it in time. Jace sat down, ate, looked at the soup in a way that wasn't complaints, but was noticing. "The cellar's losing temperature," he said. Harper looked up from her own bowl. "How do you know?" "The turnips. You wouldn't have missed 2 going bad if the cellar was holding right. Something's letting cold in, probably a gap in the door frame." Harper set down her spoon. She'd thought the bad turnips were just bad turnips. She hadn't considered the cellar. "I'll look at it tomorrow," Jace said. "You've got the east fence line to check tomorrow." "I'll do both." He said it without impatience, just as a statement of capacity. Then he paused, and something shifted in his manner, less tactical, more careful. "How much of the root store is left?" Harper told him. He did the math in his head. She could see him doing it, that particular stillness. "It's tight," he said. "I know it's tight. We might need to—" He stopped, started again. "The Hereford that's been limping, the older one. She's not going to make it to calving in good shape. If she goes down in a hard, cold snap, we lose the carcass value too. It might be better to— I know what you're going to say. I'm not saying it to be hard. I know that too." Harper looked at the table. The limping Hereford was named, stupidly, Thomas's habit, not hers, Russet. She was 8 years old and had given good calves, 3 of them, but her left foreleg had been troublesome since October, and the cold was not improving it. "I'll think about it." Jace nodded and didn't push. That restraint cost him something. She could see it was a thing he was choosing, not a thing that came natural, and she noticed it. Lila, from her spot at the counter, said quietly, "She knows." Both of them looked at her. "The cow," Lila said. "She knows something's wrong with her leg. She's been standing close to the fence on the south side because the ground there's drier. She's trying to keep the weight off it." A silence. "I'll look at it tomorrow," Harper said, before I decide anything. She looked at Russet the next morning, and Jace was right. It wasn't a decision she liked. She made it anyway, and Jace handled it with a clean efficiency that she was grateful for and didn't say so directly. Just made sure there was a good supper that night and left it at that. The meat from Russet went into the smokehouse, which improved the food stores considerably. Harper put that in the practical column and tried not to think about the other column. Tate. The debt collectors came on the 19th day. There were 2 of them, men from the Caldwell lending office in Harker Falls, 40 miles west, which held the largest of Thomas's 3 outstanding notes. Harper had been expecting them. What she hadn't been expecting was the timing, mid-morning on a clear day, which meant they'd made a deliberate early start to catch her before she could prepare. She was in the yard checking the water trough when she heard the horses on the road. She turned and watched them come. 2 men, well-dressed for the weather in heavy coats, riding horses that cost more than anything she currently owned. Jace was at the woodpile 20 feet away. He stopped splitting and held the axe at his side, watching. The taller of the 2 men, late 40s, gray in his mustache, the kind of face that had learned to look pleasant while doing unpleasant things, swung down and introduced himself as Mr. Halford, associate of the Caldwell office. The other one stayed on his horse and wrote things in a notebook without being introduced. Mrs. Wren, Halford said, in the tone of a man who has practiced sounding reasonable, we've been patient. I think you'd agree. You've been within the terms of the note, Harper said, which isn't quite the same thing as patience, but I'll take the charitable interpretation. Halford's pleasant expression recalibrated slightly. The Caldwell office is concerned about the current state of the property. Our understanding was that your husband maintained a workforce. We see evidence of... He looked around the yard. His gaze moved over Jace, who was still standing at the woodpile with the axe. A reduced operation. My operation is exactly what it is, Harper said. I'm current on the interest payments. The next principal payment isn't due until March. March is correct. However, the office has the right, per the terms of the agreement, to conduct a property assessment if we have reason to believe the collateral value is declining. Then conduct it, Harper said. I'll walk you through myself. She didn't want to walk them through. Her back was aching and her feet were cold, and the last thing she wanted was to spend an hour following 2 men in expensive coats around her property, watching them write things down. But she also knew that if she refused or delayed or showed anything they could characterize as evasion, it would go into their report in a way that cost her. She walked them through, the barn first, and she made sure to show the repaired corner, the new post, the solid beam. Halford's note-taking companion wrote something. The hay store, which was depleted but organized, stacked properly, not obviously wasteful. The cattle, 10 now, in the south pasture. The house, which she did not let them inside, making the point quietly that she had not agreed to an interior inspection and would not be doing one today. Halford stood in the yard at the end of it and looked at everything with that pleasant expression that wasn't. It's a struggling operation, he said. It's a functioning one, Harper said. There's a difference. The office will want additional assurance regarding the March payment. The March payment will be made. From what source, may I ask? Harper looked at him steadily. From the proceeds of cattle sales in February, combined with current cash reserves. She was being aggressive with that characterization. Her cash reserves were thin enough to be embarrassing, but the cattle sales in February were real. Jace had already identified 2 buyers in Millhaven who were looking for Herefords in early spring. Halford looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Jace, who had moved from the woodpile to a position about 15 feet closer and was doing nothing aggressive, just standing there with the axe handle resting on his shoulder and the quiet attention of someone who is remembering a conversation accurately. We'll be in touch, Halford said. I expect you will, Harper said. They left. Harper waited until they were out of the yard and on the road before she let herself exhale. Jace came up beside her. He was checking for signs we're abandoning the property, he said. I know. The notebook. His man was counting the cattle. I know that too. A pause. The February sales. Are those confirmed? 2 conversations, not contracts. He was quiet for a moment. I can go to Millhaven this week and push for letters of intent. Something on paper. If Caldwell comes back, you'd have something to show them. Harper looked at him sideways. He was 16 years old, and he had just described a strategy that her husband, a grown man who'd been running this ranch for 7 years, had never thought to execute. "That would be useful," she said. "I'll go Thursday, if the weather holds." She nodded. They stood there for another moment, watching the road where the two men had gone. "Harper," Jace said. She looked at him. "They're going to keep coming back." "Yes. So we need the ranch to actually look like it's recovering, not just surviving." He shifted the axe to his other shoulder. "I've been thinking about the timber on the North Ridge. Thomas never cut it commercially. I can see the stands from the fence line. If those trees are the right size and species, that's value sitting there that nobody's counted." Harper had thought about the timber before and shelved it as too complicated for a widow in debt to manage. But that was before she had a 16-year-old with a brown paper notebook doing strategic analysis at her kitchen table. "We'd need someone to assess it," she said. "I know a man in Millhaven who does timber appraisals. I heard Mrs. Aldis mention him." He said it carefully, not quite meeting her eye, which was the tell that he'd been planning this particular piece of the conversation for longer than today. "You've been thinking about this for a while," Harper said. He shrugged. The non-committal version. "Jace?" He looked at her. "That's good," she said. "The thinking. Keep doing it." Something moved across his face, quick, almost hidden, the expression of someone who has been told their work is worth something and doesn't quite know what to do with that information yet. Then it was gone, and he was practical again. "I'll go to Millhaven Thursday," he said. Letters of intent and the timberman. He went back to the woodpile, and she went inside, where Lila was doing something careful and focused at the kitchen table with a bit of leather cord and 2 pieces of wire, making something Harper couldn't quite identify yet. "Was that the bank?" Lila asked, without looking up. "Lending office, not exactly the bank." "Are they going to take the ranch?" Harper sat down across from her, slowly, with the weight of 7.5 months behind her. "Not if I can help it," she said. Lila worked the cord through the wire with her small, precise fingers. "Jace will figure something out," she said. Not as comfort, as observation. "He's already working on it," Harper said. Lila looked up briefly. Something in her face was different from the careful blankness of the first 2 weeks. Not open exactly, but permeable. Like a window that has been stuck for a long time and has shifted slightly in its frame. "He always does," she said. "Even when it's hard. Even when he's scared." Harper looked at her. "He gets scared?" Lila went back to her cord and wire. "Everybody gets scared," she said quietly. "He just doesn't show it until the problem's solved." Harper sat with that for a moment. Outside, the sound of the axe resumed. Steady, regular, working through the woodpile with the patient focus of someone who has decided that what they're doing matters. The temperature dropped another 4 degrees by afternoon, and by evening the sky to the north had taken on that particular yellow-gray color that every person who has spent a winter in Montana learns to recognize and does not like to see. Harper stood at the kitchen window after supper and watched it. "How long?" Jace asked from the table. 2 days, Harper said. "Maybe less." He nodded and went back to his notebook. Lila added wood to the stove without being asked. The ranch was still in trouble. The debt was still real. The road ahead was still harder than Harper could fully account for from where she was standing. But in the kitchen, the fire was burning, and across the table there was a boy doing math on behalf of a future he'd decided to invest himself in. And beside the stove there was a girl who noticed the cold before it arrived and did something about it. That was not nothing. That was in fact a great deal more than nothing. The storm came in faster than the sky had promised. Harper had said 2 days. She had been wrong by roughly 36 hours, which in a Montana winter was the difference between prepared and caught. By the following evening, not 2 days out but 1, the wind had shifted hard from the northwest and the temperature had dropped 15 degrees in 4 hours, and the snow was coming in sideways, the kind that didn't fall so much as a salt, driving under door frames and through the gap at the base of the kitchen window that Jace had been meaning to reseal and hadn't gotten to yet. He got to it that night, working by lamplight with a strip of oilcloth and tacks, while the wind made the house sound like something alive and unhappy. Harper sat at the table with both hands around a cup of hot water and watched him work without offering help he didn't need. "That'll hold?" she asked. "For tonight." He pressed the last tack in with his thumb. It needs proper caulking when the cold breaks. Add it to the list. He almost said something about the list being long enough already, but didn't. She knew how long the list was. She'd been living with it longer than he had. That night, the temperature dropped to what Harper estimated was somewhere below zero, the kind of cold that makes the wood of a house tick and crack as it contracts, the kind that finds every weakness in a structure and makes its presence known. She lay awake listening to it and doing the same mental inventory she'd been doing every night for weeks: cattle, feed, water, wood supply, food stores, the baby, the debt. Running through each item like checking fences after a hard wind, looking for what had given way. The baby had been restless all day, more active than usual, lower than usual, with a heaviness to the movement that was different from the rolling kicks of the past few weeks. Harper had been 9 years old when her own mother had her youngest brother, and had been present for enough of that process to have some rough understanding of what different stages felt like from the outside. She was trying not to think about what this particular feeling meant in terms of timing. She was 6 weeks from the date Dr. Emmett in Millhaven had given her. 6 weeks was not nothing. She fell asleep sometime after midnight and woke at 3 to a sound that took her a moment to place. Lila, moving in the hallway, adding wood to the small stove in the upstairs corridor that kept the pipes from freezing. Quiet, precise, no wasted movement. Harper lay still and listened to her do it and felt something she was becoming familiar with. The particular relief of not being alone in a hard situation, which was different from the ordinary comfort of company and came with its own complicated texture. By morning, the valley was sealed. Jace went out at first light to check the cattle and came back an hour later with ice in his eyebrows and a report that was factual and unembellished the way his reports always were. The herd was bunched in the south corner, which was sheltered. The hay station was accessible, but the path was drifted bad. The water trough had a skin of ice he'd broken through. The barn was holding. The north fence had a post down under the snow load, but it wasn't urgent because nothing was getting through that snow in either direction anyway. "How bad is the drift on the road?" Harper asked. He pulled off his outer coat and hung it near the stove. "Road's gone," he said. "Not passable. Not for days." Harper had known this was coming. She'd known it since the previous evening when she'd watched the sky do what it was doing, but hearing it stated plainly still landed differently than anticipating it. "All right," she said. Lila was making a thin porridge at the stove. Oats, water, a scrape of the last of the honey. She served it without comment, and the three of them ate in the particular quiet of people conserving energy for what the day was going to require. It was on the second day of the storm's full lockdown that Harper's body began telling her something she didn't want to hear. It started as pressure, low, persistent, the kind that made her shift her position every few minutes without finding relief. She'd been on her feet too much the day before, helping Jace move hay bales from the outer stack to the barn entrance because the path had drifted again and the work required 2 people. She'd told herself it was strain from the lifting and the cold and the difficult footing. She'd told herself that for most of the morning. By early afternoon, the pressure had a rhythm. She was in the kitchen, sitting at the table with Thomas's ledger open in front of her. She'd been going through it again, looking for anything she might have missed, some asset or notation she'd overlooked, when the first real contraction hit. Not a warning pressure. An actual contraction, squeezing and specific, lasting about 40 seconds and then releasing. Harper set down her pencil. She sat very still and breathed through her nose and counted the way she'd heard you were supposed to count, and waited to see if it happened again. It happened again. 11 minutes later. She closed the ledger. Lila was in the back room doing something with the herbs she'd been drying since November, organizing them, labeling them in her careful block printing on small strips of paper. Harper stood in the doorway and waited until Lila looked up. "I need you to get Jace," Harper said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt, which was useful. Lila looked at her face and then at the way she was standing. One hand on the doorframe, weight shifted, the particular stance of a body managing something. The girl's eyes went still in the way they did when she was processing something serious. She put down the herbs and went without another word. Jace came in from outside, where he'd been digging out the path to the barn for the 3rd time. He came in with snow on his shoulders and took one look at Harper and said, "How far apart?" 11 minutes the last 2 times. It might slow down. "It might," he said, in the tone of someone who was not counting on that. He stood in the middle of the kitchen for a moment, And Harper watched him do the things she'd seen him do before with the barn corner and the debt figures and the Caldwell men. Take inventory, calculate, decide. He was 16 years old, and there was no doctor within 12 miles, and 12 miles might as well have been 100 under 4 feet of drifted snow. And he was standing in her kitchen working out what to do about it with the same focused expression he used on fence post problems. "Is there anything in the house," he said, "anything written down about how to—" He stopped, reorganized. "Your husband, did he have any medical books? Almanac, anything?" "There's a farm almanac in the bedroom, Thomas's shelf. And there's a small medical guide, green cover, third shelf from the left." Jace was moving before she finished. He came back with both books and put them on the table and opened the medical guide to the index with the focused speed of someone who learned early that panicking was a luxury and had stopped affording it. "Sit down," he said, not looking up from the index. "I'm fine standing." "You'll be more useful to yourself sitting." He looked up briefly. "Please?" Harper sat down. Lila came and stood beside her, not touching, just present. She had brought a folded blanket from somewhere and set it on the chair next to Harper without explanation, which was so precisely Lila that Harper might have smiled under different circumstances. "Okay," Jace said, reading. He turned pages. He stopped on something, read it, turned back 2 pages, and read that, then went forward again. His jaw was set and his eyes were moving fast and his hands were completely steady on the book. "Okay, first thing. We need the bedroom to be warm. Warmer than this room. The fire in there needs to be built up now and kept up." He looked at Lila. Lila nodded and left the room. He looked back at the book. "Water," he said. "I need water boiling, 2 pots." "What for?" "I don't entirely know yet, but the book says boiling water and I'd rather have it and not need it." He stood up straight and looked at her. And for just a moment the calculation dropped and she could see something underneath it. Not panic, but the recognition of weight. The acknowledgement of how serious this was. It passed in 2 seconds, and then he was practical again. "This is 6 weeks early," he said. "Yes. The book says premature births require, it says keeping the baby warm is the most important thing, more important than almost anything else." Harper looked at him. Her hands were folded on the table, and she was working on keeping her breathing even. "Jace," she said. He looked at her. "You're doing the right things," she said. "Keep doing them." Something moved through him. A straightening, a settling. He nodded once and turned back to the book. The contractions progressed through the afternoon with an efficiency that suggested the baby had made its decision and was not interested in negotiation. By 4 o'clock, they were 7 minutes apart. By 6, they were 5. Harper had been moved to the bedroom, which Lila had transformed in 2 hours into something genuinely warmer than the rest of the house. The fire built high and stoked with the kind of religious attention that Lila gave to all fire-related tasks. Extra blankets layered over the bed, the small lamp turned up, a pot of water steaming on the bedroom hearth that Jace had set up with a flat stone and a trivet. Harper was not having an easy time of it. She was not a woman who complained, had never been, even as a child, had always had the particular stubbornness about pain that some people are born with and some acquire. But the labor was hard. Harder than she'd been prepared for, the contractions coming long and squeezing, and the gaps between them too short to fully recover. She gripped the iron headboard and breathed through the worst of them. And in the spaces between, she answered Jace's careful, book-referencing questions as clearly as she could. "Is the pain in your back or in front?" he asked, at one point reading something. "Both," she said. "More the front." He nodded, read something else. "Can you change position? The book says, moving around can help if you're able." "I'm aware," Harper said through her teeth, which was as close to sharp as she'd let herself get. Then, "Sorry." "Don't apologize," he said flatly. "Tell me what you need." Lila appeared with a damp cloth she'd been keeping cool in the corridor, where the temperature was lower than the bedroom. She pressed it to Harper's forehead without being asked, without any particular tenderness, just with the matter-of-fact care of someone who knows what a person in physical distress needs and provides it. Harper closed her eyes for a moment. "Thank you," she said. Lila squeezed out the cloth and folded it. "Just breathe," she said. The storm was screaming outside. Harper could hear it even through the thick walls, the wind slamming against the north side of the house in waves, the occasional hard percussion of something, a branch, a loose board, striking the exterior. Inside the bedroom, it was the warmest it had been in months. The fire was too large for the room, really, making it almost hot, and that was exactly right. At 7:40 in the evening, with Jace reading aloud from the medical guide in a voice that was steady and clear and broke only once, briefly, controlled, covered by a cough, and Lila maintaining the fire and the warm water and the damp cloth and the calm that the room required, Harper Wren's baby came into the world. She was small, smaller than Harper had expected, smaller than felt entirely safe, with skin that was almost translucent at the wrists, and a face that was scrunched and red and furious at the indignity of the whole situation, which Harper found, through the fog of exhaustion and pain and the strange floating relief of it being over, unexpectedly reassuring. Furious was alive. Furious was working. The baby made a sound, not a full cry, not the robust announcing wail that the medical guide had described, but a thin, reedy complaint, a sound that said, "I am here and I am not happy about it." And that was enough, more than enough. It was everything. Jace had the baby wrapped in the flannel Harper had put aside weeks ago, the warmest piece of fabric in the house, before Harper could reach for it. He moved with a kind of desperate, careful precision she would think about later, the way you think about things that happen in the dark that you almost lost. He held the bundle for a moment, just a moment, looking at the small red face with an expression she'd never seen on him before. Stripped of all the calculation, all the assessment, just open and young and wrecked in some way she didn't have words for. Then he settled the bundle against Harper's chest and stepped back. Harper looked at her daughter. She was alive. 6 weeks early, small enough to be frightening, in a ranch house cut off from the world by the worst storm of the year, but alive. Breathing in the rapid, shallow way the medical guide had warned about, which needed watching, but breathing. "Nova," Harper said. Jace looked up from the book he'd already gone back to, checking the section on newborn care. "That's her name," Harper said. "Nova Wren." He looked at the baby, then back at the book. "The book says the breathing," he read. "The fast breathing is normal for early babies. It should slow over the first day. We need to keep her warm. The most important thing is—" "Warm," Harper said. "I know. We're working on it." Lila had moved to the end of the bed and was looking at the baby with an expression that was the most unguarded thing Harper had seen from her yet, wide and wondering, and something that was not quite the blankness she usually carried, something that had cracked open just slightly. She didn't reach for the baby. She just looked at her, the way she looked at living things she was trying to understand. "Nova," Lila said, testing the word. "Yes," Harper said. Lila looked at her face. Something in the girl's eyes was wet, though her expression was still mostly controlled. She turned away quickly and went back to the fire, adding a careful piece of wood with steady hands that Harper suspected cost her some effort to keep that way. Jace sat down in the chair he'd pulled to the bedside 2 hours ago and put the medical guide in his lap and leaned his head back against the wall and closed his eyes. His face, in the firelight, was exhausted in a way that went past physical. The exhaustion of someone who has held themselves at maximum tension for hours and has only just been given permission to release it. He breathed. He was, Harper realized, trying to make sure she didn't see him doing it. She let him have that. The storm continued. Nova breathed her rapid, shallow breaths, and Harper held her close for warmth and counted each one like they were coins she was safeguarding. The fire burned. The wind hit the house in waves that made the walls creak and the lamp flicker, and the lamp steadied, and the walls held. At some point, Lila was asleep on the floor near the hearth, curled on the folded quilt she'd brought, her breathing slow and even. At some point, Jace's head had dropped forward onto his chest, the medical guide still open on his knee, his hand holding it loosely even in sleep. Harper lay in the warmest room on the Wren Ranch, in the middle of the worst storm she'd seen in years, 12 miles from the nearest help, and surrounded by 2 children she'd brought home 3 weeks ago as an act of calculated desperation, and held her daughter against her chest and listened to her breathe. The sound was thin and imperfect and absolutely real. It was enough. The storm broke on the 4th day. It didn't end so much as exhaust itself. The wind dropping off in stages through the night, the snow thinning from a wall to a curtain to a scatter, and by morning a silence that felt almost loud after 4 days of the other thing. Harper heard it from the bedroom, that particular quality of quiet that follows a Montana blizzard, and she lay still for a moment just listening to it before Nova made the small snuffling sound that meant she was waking up and wanted to eat. Nova had made it through the first 4 days. That was not a small thing. Harper knew enough, had read enough of the medical guide in the hours she'd been awake at night while the baby slept on her chest, to understand that the first 4 days for a premature infant in a ranch house without a doctor were the days that determined everything. Nova's breathing had been rapid and shallow for the first 2, which had kept Harper in a state of controlled dread that she'd managed by doing what she always did with dread, breaking it into pieces small enough to act on. Keep her warm, keep her fed, count the breaths, notice if they change. On the 3rd day, the breathing had slowed to something closer to normal. On the 4th day, Nova had cried, a real cry, not the thin complaint of the first night, but something with actual force behind it, something that said, "I intend to be here." And Jace had appeared in the bedroom doorway with the medical guide already open to the relevant section. Read that sustained crying in a premature newborn was a positive developmental indicator, and then gone back to the kitchen with a look on his face that he probably thought Harper hadn't seen. She'd seen it. She was keeping a private inventory of those moments. The things that crossed his face when he didn't know she was watching. They told her more about him than anything he'd said directly. The morning after the storm broke, Jace went out to assess the damage. He was gone 2 hours. Harper was up, slowly, carefully, with the particular caution of a body that had done something enormous and was still accounting for it, making coffee when he came back in, stomping snow from his boots in the entry. "Report," she said. He pulled off his coat. His expression was the working one, neutral, taking inventory. "East fence lost 2 more posts. The woodpile's buried, but it's all there. I dug down and checked. Hay station's accessible. Cattle are all present. I counted twice." He paused. "The North Ridge Trail is clear enough that a horse could get through in another day, maybe 2. Once it packs a little. That means the road to Millhaven. 3 days. Maybe 4 if another front comes in, but the sky looks clear." Harper poured his coffee and set it on the table. Nova was in the wooden box she'd padded and placed near the kitchen stove, which had become the baby's primary location during the day. Warm, visible from anywhere in the room, close enough that any change in sound was immediately apparent. Lila was beside her, as she had been for most of the past 4 days, doing her work within arm's reach of the box with the focused proximity of a small guardian who hadn't been appointed to the role but had taken it anyway. Jace looked at the box as he sat down. He did this every time he came into the kitchen, a quick check, involuntary, like checking a fence line. Then he looked at his coffee. "There's something else," he said. Harper sat across from him. "Go ahead." "I went through to the woodlot to check the timber stands while I was out." He wrapped both hands around the cup. "The north section. It's better than I thought from the fence line. There's a significant stand of mature ponderosa, and there's Douglas fir on the upper slope that looks like it's been growing undisturbed for a long time." He looked up at her. "I'm not a timberman. I can't give you numbers. But the density and the size of those trees, Harper, that's not nothing. That might be considerably more than nothing." She looked at him. Thomas never had it assessed. Thomas never had a lot of things assessed. He said it without cruelty, just as a statement of what they both knew. The Caldwell note, part of what he told them the ranch was worth was based on the land value. But if the timber on that north ridge was counted as a separate asset, or if there was a commercial arrangement with a logging operation. He stopped, thought, "I don't know what the numbers look like. I don't have enough information, but I think you should find out before you let Caldwell or anyone else tell you what this property is worth." Harper thought about the ledger, about the 3 notes, the total that had sat on her kitchen table like a stone for 3 months. She thought about Halford and his notebook man counting cattle in the yard. "You think Thomas didn't know?" she said. Jay shrugged. "I think Thomas borrowed against what he could see. The cattle, the land, the house. The timber's up a ridge you can't see from the yard. If nobody walked up there and looked at it, nobody counted it. And you walked up there, yesterday, before the last snowband came through." He looked at his cup. "I wanted to know what we had." Harper sat with that for a moment. The "we" was not something she was going to remark on. It was something she was going to let sit where it had landed and see if it stayed. "Calvin," she said. Jace looked up. Thomas's brother. He brought me the ledger at the funeral. He knows the property, knew Thomas better than anyone. She'd been avoiding Calvin since August, not out of hostility, but out of the particular exhaustion of grief that makes every related conversation feel like too much. If there are assets Thomas didn't properly account for, Calvin might know about them. He might know things that aren't in the ledger. Is he in the area? Harker Falls. About 40 miles. Jace considered this. Can you write to him? I can write to him today. Once the road to Millhaven is open, someone can carry the letter. Tell him about the timber, Jace said. Ask him directly if Thomas ever had it assessed. Ask him about the northern acreage specifically. He paused, and she could see him choosing his next words with care. And ask him if there were any agreements, any arrangements Thomas had with other parties that might not have made it into the main ledger. Harper looked at him. Why? Jace was quiet for a moment. He had the look of someone who has been carrying a thought for a while and is deciding how much of it to say. Because the Caldwell note was the third note, he said, and the third note was for a timber investment that went nowhere. But what if it didn't go nowhere? What if it just didn't go where Thomas thought it was going? He held up a hand before she could speak. I don't know that. I'm speculating. But the northern acreage and a failed timber investment in the same story seems like something worth asking about. Harper was quiet. Outside, Lila had moved to the window and was looking at the cleared sky the way she looked at things she was filing away for later reference. Nova made a small sound in her box, and Lila glanced at her, checked her, went back to the window. You're 16 years old, Harper said. Jace looked at her. I know how old I am. I know you do. I'm just... She stopped. There wasn't a way to finish that sentence that didn't come out sounding like something she wasn't ready to say. She started a different one. Write down what you just told me. All of it, in order, the way you said it. I want to have it in front of me when I write to Calvin. He pulled his brown paper notebook from his coat pocket. It lived there now, apparently, and started writing. Gee. The letter to Calvin Wren went out with the first rider able to make the Millhaven Road, which was 4 days after the storm broke. Harper wrote it straight, the way she did things. No preamble, no softening. She told him about the timber on the North Ridge, about Jace's assessment of the stand, about the question of whether Thomas had ever had it formally appraised. She asked about the third note, the timber investment up north, and whether Calvin knew what exactly that investment had been, and whether there was any documentation beyond what was in the main ledger. She told him about Nova, 2 lines, because he was Thomas's brother and had a right to know. She did not ask for help in any form that could be read as asking for help. She asked for information, which was different. Calvin's reply came back 8 days later, carried by a Millhaven man who'd been passing through Harker Falls on other business. She read it at the kitchen table. Jace and Lila were both present, Jace at the table with his notebook, Lila standing at the counter shelling the dried beans she'd been working through for a week. They watched her read. When she finished, she put the letter flat on the table and looked at it for a moment. Well, she said. Good or bad? Jace asked. Both. She looked up. Calvin says Thomas had the northern timber assessed in 1879, 4 years ago. He didn't tell me because he didn't want me to know about the third note, and the assessment was tied to the third note. She pressed her fingers on the letter. The investment up north. It wasn't a failed timber venture. Thomas lent money to a logging cooperative that was supposed to operate on shared land adjacent to our North Ridge. The cooperative dissolved, but the assessment it commissioned included our property as part of a regional survey. Jace had his pencil out. And? Calvin has a copy of the assessment. He says the northern acreage on this property was valued at approximately $430 in timber resources at 1879 prices. She looked at him steadily. Timber prices have gone up since 1879. The pencil stopped. Jace stared at her. 430, he said. At 1879 prices, Calvin says current market rate for mature ponderosa in this region is running higher than it was 4 years ago. He doesn't give me a specific figure, but he says, and I'm reading directly, the stand Tom had on that ridge would not have been worth less than $600 at today's prices, and could run higher depending on a proper current survey. Jace looked at the ceiling. His lips moved slightly, doing arithmetic. The Caldwell note is $480, he said. Yes. So the timber is potentially worth more than the largest debt. Yes. Harper folded the letter. If it can be liquidated, which requires a logging arrangement and time and a current assessment that we can use in a negotiation with Caldwell. Lila had stopped shelling beans. She was looking at Harper with her full, still attention. Calvin, Jay said, can he help with the assessment? Does he have contacts? He says he knows a timber broker in Harker Falls who does regional assessments. He'll arrange an introduction if I want one. She paused. He also says, she opened the letter again, found the place. He says he should have told me about this in August, that he thought he was protecting me from the complication, and he understands now that he was wrong. She closed the letter again, which is a Calvin thing to say. He was always better at understanding his mistakes than preventing them. Jace made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was in the neighborhood. So the plan, he said, pulling his notebook to a fresh page. Get the current timber assessment. Use it to establish the actual value of the property. Take that to Caldwell before the March payment as evidence that the collateral on their note is more substantial than their current assessment. And negotiate, Harper said. Not beg. Negotiate. If the property is worth what Calvin thinks the timber alone might be worth, we have a position. We're not supplicants. We're a property owner with documented assets coming to discuss the terms of a debt that is manageable against those assets. Jace was writing fast. The cattle sales in February, he said. Did you get the letters of intent from Millhaven? 2. Both signed, 1 for 4 head, 1 for 3. He nodded. So we go to Caldwell with signed purchase letters, a current timber assessment, and a structured payment proposal for the remaining notes. He looked up. That's different from what we had 3 weeks ago. Considerably different. He looked down at his notebook, looked up again. This is going to work, he said. He said it not like a reassurance and not like a boast. He said it the way he said things he'd calculated, as an assessment. Harper looked at him for a long moment. It might work, she said, which is not the same thing. Don't get ahead of the numbers. He accepted the correction with a nod, but the set of his jaw didn't change. Lila picked up a dried bean and rolled it between her fingers. What does Caldwell get from foreclosing, she said, without looking up, if the property is worth more than the debt? Both Harper and Jace looked at her. They'd have to sell it themselves, Lila continued. Find a buyer, handle the property. That's complicated. She looked up. It's easier for them if we pay, right? A short silence. Yes, Harper said. That's exactly right. So show them it's easier to negotiate than to foreclose, Lila said, and went back to her beans. Jace looked at Harper. Harper looked back at him. She's right, he said. She generally is, Harper said. The weeks that followed the storm were harder in some ways than the weeks before it, because the snow had damaged what was already fragile, and the cold showed no signs of releasing its grip on the valley. The east fence required 3 days of repair work that left Jace's hands raw even through his gloves. 2 of the remaining cattle developed respiratory symptoms in a cold snap that arrived the second week of January. Harper and Jace worked with the 2 sick animals through 2 nights, moving them to the barn's warmest corner, managing their feed, watching for the signs the almanac described that would mean it had progressed beyond what rest and warmth could address. Both animals recovered. It was not smooth. It was not a process anyone would have described as going well. But they were alive at the end of it, which was the only metric that mattered. Nova grew. She was still small, would probably be small for a long while. The medical guide suggested that premature infants often took time to catch up to their expected size. But she was gaining weight in the careful way that things gain weight when feeding is consistent and warmth is maintained and someone is paying close attention. Lila was paying the closest attention. She had developed a system with the feeding schedule that she tracked on a small piece of paper she kept on the kitchen windowsill. Not because Harper asked her to, but because Lila had noticed in the chaotic first days after the birth that tracking was better than approximating, and she'd simply started doing it. Harper had found the paper on the 3rd day and stared at it for a long moment. The handwriting was careful and neat. The entries were precise. She hadn't said anything to Lila about it, just put the paper back on the windowsill where she'd found it. It was still there, still being updated. In the third week of January, Calvin Wren arrived. He came unannounced, or rather, the letter announcing his arrival arrived the same day he did, carried by the same horse, because Calvin had sent it from Millhaven that morning and then ridden out himself. He was 60, heavy-set, with Thomas's eyes and an older and more weathered version of Thomas's face, and he stood in the yard with his hat in his hands and looked at Harper with the expression of a man who has been rehearsing something and has just realized none of the rehearsed versions are adequate. "Harper," he said. "Calvin," she said. He looked at her. She was thinner than she'd been. He could probably see that, but upright, capable, wearing the look of a woman who has been through a significant amount and is still standing in her own yard. He looked at the barn, the house, the yard, taking inventory the way the Caldwell men had taken inventory, but with different eyes, the eyes of someone who understood what he was looking at. "You fixed the north corner of the barn," he said. "Jace did." Calvin looked at Jace, who had appeared from the direction of the woodpile at the sound of a horse, and was standing at a respectful distance, watching. "Boy's got good hands," Calvin said. "He does," Harper said. "Come inside. There's coffee and there's a lot to talk about." Calvin came inside. He met Nova, held her with the careful inexperience of a man who hasn't held an infant in some decades, looked at her small face with Thomas's eyes, and didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he put her back in the box near the stove and straightened up and looked at Harper. "She looks like him," he said. "Some," Harper said. "She also looks like herself." He accepted that with a nod. They sat down with the coffee. Jace put his notebook on the table. Calvin looked at the notebook, looked at Jace. Something in his assessment shifted. "You're the one who found the timber," Calvin said. "I walked the North Ridge, yeah," Jace said. "I had questions. Harper said you might have answers." Calvin pulled a folded document from his coat, the 1879 assessment, carefully kept for 4 years in what Harper suspected was a drawer Calvin had been looking at with guilt for some portion of that time. He spread it on the table. Jace pulled it toward him and started reading with the focused speed he brought to all written information. They talked for 3 hours. At the end of it, there was a plan on the table that was more than a plan. See, it was a document, written in Jace's careful hand with Calvin's corrections and Harper's decisions noted in the margins, that laid out a sequenced approach to the debt negotiation. Calvin would arrange the current timber assessment through his contact in Harker Falls. Harper would take the assessment, the signed cattle purchase letters, and a structured renegotiation proposal to the Caldwell office before the March payment date, requesting an extended term in exchange for documented evidence of the property's recovery trajectory. Calvin would accompany her, which he offered and she accepted, not because she needed the escort, but because a 60-year-old man with local standing sitting next to a 31-year-old widow changed the texture of a negotiation in ways that were practical rather than comfortable. It wasn't a guaranteed outcome. The ranch was still in debt, still operating on thin margins, still one bad cold snap away from an animal loss that could set everything back. Harper knew that. She wasn't fooling herself about any of it, but she was sitting at her kitchen table with a document in her hand that had not existed 4 months ago, a plan built from a coin she'd kept in her pocket and a walk to an orphan station and a 16-year-old who walked to North Ridge in winter to find out what they had. Nova made a sound from her box. Lila was at her side in 3 steps, checking, finding nothing wrong, just waking, just present, just making the particular sounds of a small person who has decided to be in the world. Calvin looked at the baby, looked at Lila, looked at Jace, who was already making a revised copy of the document in his notebook. "Thomas would have liked these kids," he said quietly to Harper. Harper looked at Jace bent over his notebook and Lila with her hand resting lightly on the edge of Nova's box. "They're not Thomas's kids," she said. "They're theirs." She paused. "And a little bit mine." Calvin looked at her. "That's not a small thing," he said. "No," Harper said. "It's not." The Caldwell meeting was set for the 2nd week of February. Harper spent the days before it the way she spent most things that frightened her, by working. She went through the cattle purchase letters 3 times, checking the figures against Jace's notebook calculations. She reviewed the 1879 timber assessment alongside the new one that Calvin's contact in Harker Falls had produced in the 1st week of February, a Mr. Dooley, a quiet man with ink-stained fingers who had walked the North Ridge in snowshoes and come back down with numbers that made Calvin exhale slowly through his nose and say nothing for a full 10 seconds, which Harper had learned to interpret as his version of significant. The current assessment placed the mature timber on the north acreage at $780 in recoverable value, at current market rates. On the conservative end, $780 against a total debt of $1,142. It wasn't enough to clear everything, but it was enough to change the conversation entirely, from a failing widow asking for mercy to a property owner with documented assets requesting a restructured term. That distance, between asking for mercy and presenting a position, was not a small distance. Harper understood that better than most people might have because she'd spent the last several months learning exactly what it felt like to be on the wrong side of it. The night before she left for Harker Falls, Jace came and sat across from her at the kitchen table after supper, while Lila put Nova down and the house settled into its nighttime quiet. He had his notebook. He always had his notebook. "You have everything you need," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I have everything we've been able to put together," Harper said. "Whether it's everything I need depends on Caldwell." He turned a page in the notebook. "Halford's going to push back on the timber valuation. He'll say it's theoretical, that the value only exists if there's a logging arrangement, and there isn't one yet." "I know." "You tell him the arrangement is in negotiation," which it is. Calvin's contact knows 2 logging operations in the region who'd want access to that ridge. The conversation has started. "I'll tell him. And the cattle letters, don't let him reframe those as speculative. They're signed. They're commitments. That's current income, not projection." Harper looked at him across the table. He was 16 years and 4 months old, and he was briefing her for a debt negotiation, the way a business partner briefs for a meeting. She thought about the boy who had sat on a bench in the Millhaven placement office and asked her how many cattle she had before he asked her anything else. She thought about how that had felt then, slightly startling, slightly impressive, and how it felt now, which was different, which was something she didn't have a clean word for. "Jace," she said. He looked up. "I'm going to be all right in that room," she said. "I need you to know that, not because I'm trying to reassure you, but because it's true. What you've done here, the notebook, the timber walk, the letters of intent, all of it, I'm going to walk in there with that, and I'm not going to apologize for what we are." She paused. "So don't spend tomorrow worrying. Spend it doing the east fence section you've been putting off." He looked at her for a moment. "The fence section isn't going anywhere," he said. "Neither is the worry. So you might as well do something useful." He almost smiled. The full version this time. Brief, crooked, there and gone. He closed the notebook and stood up. "Harper," he said. She waited. "Whatever they say tomorrow, whatever Caldwell does, the ranch is better than it was. That's not nothing. That's already done." She looked at him standing there in the kitchen firelight, this boy who had arrived 3 months ago with a badly cut haircut and a face like a closed door, and she felt something move through her chest that she recognized and did not try to name. "Go to bed," she said. He went. The Caldwell meeting lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. Halford was there, and his notebook man, and a third man Harper hadn't seen before, who was introduced as a senior associate and who said very little but watched everything. Calvin sat beside Harper and was exactly what she'd needed him to be. Present, solid, saying the right things at the right moments and leaving the rest to her. Harper presented the timber assessment first. Let the number sit on the table where they could all see it. Then the cattle letters. Then the structured proposal, a revised payment schedule that extended the Caldwell note by 18 months in exchange for a partial payment made today from the February cattle sale proceeds, with the timber arrangement to be formalized within 60 days as additional collateral documentation. Halford pushed back on the timber valuation, as Jace had predicted. Harper told him the logging arrangement was in active negotiation, as Jace had prepared her to say. Halford pushed back on the extended term. Harper told him that the alternative, foreclosure on a property whose true collateral value had been underrepresented in the original assessment, would require the Caldwell office to manage a sale, find a buyer, and handle all the attendant complications of a contested estate in a county where land transactions moved slowly. She said it without heat, just as a description of the landscape. The third man, the silent one, looked at the timber assessment again. They broke for 30 minutes. Harper and Calvin sat in the anteroom, and Calvin ate a biscuit he'd brought in his coat pocket without offering her one, which was so characteristic of Calvin that it settled her nerves slightly through sheer familiarity. "You did well in there," he said, with his mouth full. "We haven't finished," Harper said. "No, but you did well." When they went back in, the senior associate did most of the talking. The Caldwell office would accept the partial payment. They would agree to a 14-month extension on the note, not 1814, with the timber arrangement to be documented and submitted within 90 days. The other two notes would remain on their current terms with one modification: a quarterly check-in process that Harper had the right to initiate if circumstances changed materially. It was not everything she'd asked for. It was considerably more than she'd had. She signed the revised agreement with a steady hand. Outside in the cold Harker Falls street afterward, Calvin stood beside her while their horses were brought around and said, "Thomas would have been proud of you." Harper thought about that for a moment. She thought about Thomas. The good version, the early version, the man who'd watched her hang blue curtains in a Montana kitchen with that particular look on his face. She thought about the ledger, the 3 notes, the timber he'd walked past 100 times without looking up the ridge. "Thomas would have been surprised," she said, "which isn't the same thing." Calvin looked at her. "He underestimated you," Harper said. Not with bitterness. She'd done the work of bitterness through the fall, and come out the other side of it into something cooler and more accurate. "He was a decent man, and he underestimated me, and I let him because it was easier. I'm not going to do that again." Calvin was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "I don't suppose you are." She told Jace and Lila about the meeting that evening, all of it, in order, with the figures. Jace tracked it in the notebook and asked 3 specific questions and then sat back and looked at the table in the way that meant he was running calculations. 14 months, he said. 14 months. If the timber arrangement comes through inside 90 days. It will. Calvin's already set up the meeting. He nodded, tapped the pencil. "Then we're operating," he said, not comfortable, but operating. "Operating," Harper agreed. Lila was feeding Nova, which she'd taken over for the evening feeding with a matter-of-factness that had stopped surprising Harper sometime in January. The baby was nearly 6 weeks old now, still small but filling out in the steady incremental way that things fill out when they are consistently cared for. She made small sounds while she ate, and Lila made no sounds at all, just held her with the competent steadiness she brought to all living things. "Does this mean we can fix the kitchen window properly?" Lila asked. Jace looked at her. "The gap at the base," Lila said, without looking up from Nova. "Jace put oilcloth on it the night the storm came, but it's still letting cold in. I can feel it from the stove." "Yes," Harper said. "We can fix the window." Lila nodded, satisfied, as if this had been the primary concern all along. Spring came to the Wren Ranch the way spring came to most places that have survived a hard winter. Not graciously, not all at once, but in the grudging incremental way of something that has been held back a long time and is releasing under pressure. March brought thaw and mud, and the particular misery of frozen ground breaking up, which made every task twice as difficult as it had been in the clean cold of deep winter. April brought the first real warmth, and with it the calving season that Harper had been counting on since November. 4 calves. Thomas had predicted 3 to 5, and they got 4, which fell exactly in the middle of that range and felt, in its unspectacular adequacy, like the ranch making a promise it intended to keep. Jace managed the calving with a competence that still caught Harper slightly off guard when she let herself notice it, moving through the process with a steadiness that the animals responded to, handling the difficult second birth at 2 in the morning without waking her, coming in at dawn with his coat ruined and a matter-of-fact report that both cow and calf were fine and the calf was nursing. "You should have woken me," Harper said. "You had enough on," he said, which was a reference to Nova's rough night and the fact that Harper had been up until midnight herself. "That's not the point." "I know it's not." He poured coffee and sat down. "I handled it. The calf is fine." Harper looked at him. This was a version of an argument they'd been having in various forms since January, about what he was and wasn't required to take on, about the difference between capability and responsibility, about the fact that she did not want him carrying things alone in the dark that she should be present for. He didn't fully agree with her position. She didn't fully agree with his. They had arrived at an imperfect middle ground that functioned, which was all any real arrangement arrived at. "Thank you," she said. He drank his coffee. The logging arrangement was finalized in early April, a regional operation out of Harker Falls that Calvin had introduced, a contract giving them access to the Northridge timber over a 3-year harvesting schedule. The first payment, received in advance against the contract, went directly to the Caldwell note. The remainder of the February cattle sales, combined with the contract advance, made the partial payment required under the revised agreement, and then some. When Harper did the new figures, the debt balance against the documented assets, the cattle value now including 4 new calves, the timber contract creating a multi-year income stream, the ranch was still in debt. But it was in debt the way a functioning business is in debt, carrying obligations that are serviced by real income, not drowning under obligations that exceed what the operation could produce. She wrote those figures in the back of Thomas's ledger, in a different ink, in her own hand. That felt important. She couldn't have said exactly why, but it felt important to write the recovery in the same book that had held the disaster, to make the ledger a complete record instead of just a document of what had gone wrong. Della Aldis came in late April for what she called a follow-up visit, and what Harper suspected was also an assessment, because Della Aldis was not a woman who made unnecessary trips. She stayed for most of a day. She sat at the kitchen table and talked with Harper and watched the household move around her with the quiet observational attention of someone who had been doing this work for a long time. She watched Jace come in from the pasture with a report on the calves and address Harper directly, specifically, with information that was organized and useful. She watched Lila manage the kitchen with a self-possessed efficiency that didn't require direction or narration. She watched Nova in her box by the stove, bigger now, rounder, with a face that was beginning to develop opinions about things, her eyes tracking movement around the room with the focused attention of an infant determined to understand her environment. At the end of the day, over coffee, Della Aldis looked at Harper and said, "This is not what I expected to see." "What did you expect?" Harper said. Harper, "Survival," Della said. "I expected to see people surviving. That's usually what I see. Arrangements that are working in the minimum sense, people getting through." She looked at the kitchen, the house, the evidence of a household that was not just getting through but was actually, in its imperfect and often difficult way, functioning. "This is more than that." Harper looked at her coffee cup. "It's been a hard winter." "I know it has. Calvin Wren wrote to me in January. He told me about the birth, about the storm." She paused. "He told me about the boy." Harper looked up. "He said the boy managed the birth," Della said, following the medical guide. "He said that without Jace, it's possible—" She stopped. "He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to." Harper was quiet for a moment. "Calvin talks more than I give him credit for," she said finally. "He does," Della agreed. "In this case, I'm glad." She left in the late afternoon, riding back toward Millhaven in the long April light. Harper watched her go from the yard and then went back inside, where Jace was at the table with his notebook and Lila was doing something with dried herbs and a piece of cheesecloth that had an organized, purposeful quality Harper had stopped trying to decode and had started simply trusting. "She's not going to take you back," Harper said. Jace didn't look up from the notebook. "I know. You knew before she came." He looked up then. "I figured," he said, with the slight inflection that meant, "Yes, and I was going to let you get there yourself." Lila was already looking at Harper with that steady gaze. "Are we staying?" she asked. She said it plainly, without the particular carefulness of someone trying not to want the answer. Harper looked at her, at both of them. "You're staying," she said. "I'm going to talk to Mrs. Aldis about making it formal, legal, documented." She paused. "If that's what you want." A silence. Lila went back to her cheesecloth. "Yes," she said, quietly and completely, the way she said things she'd already settled within herself. Jace looked at the notebook. His jaw moved. He wrote something, Harper couldn't see what, and then closed the notebook and set the pencil down. "Yeah," he said. Came out rougher than he probably intended. "Yeah, that's what I want." Summer arrived fully in June, and with it the particular character of the Wren Ranch in a state of motion. Not crisis motion, not the panicked scrambling of a household in survival mode, but the steady working motion of people who know what they're doing and why they're doing it. The cattle herd now stood at 14, including the 4 spring calves who were growing well. The east fence had been fully repaired, and the north corner of the barn that had started all of this, the rot, the risk, the decision to walk to an orphan station rather than sit in a failing kitchen counting coins, was solid and weathertight with the lumber Jace had sourced in March and installed with the same patient precision he brought to everything structural. The kitchen window had been properly caulked. The root cellar door had been reframed and now held temperature correctly, which Lila had confirmed by monitoring the stored vegetables for a month and noting the absence of any further losses. The woodpile was stacked high, higher than it had been in years, Harper suspected, based on the weathering marks on the shed wall, because Jace had started on it in April and didn't stop until it was stacked to a height that satisfied his calculations about what the next winter would require. He did that with most things. Worked ahead. Planned for what wasn't here yet. It was the habit of a person who had learned young that the things you didn't prepare for were the ones that got you, and it was useful on a ranch in a way that was difficult to overstate. Harper had filed the formal guardianship paperwork in May. Della Aldis had provided the supporting documentation. Calvin had served as witness. There had been a brief practical meeting in the county seat, a clerk who asked questions that Harper answered directly, a document that emerged from the other side of that meeting with 2 names on it, Jace Mercer and Lila Mercer, as wards of Harper Wren of the Wren property on Danner Road, with all the legal weight and permanence that implied. Jace had folded his copy of the document and put it in the inside pocket of his coat. He hadn't mentioned it again. Lila had looked at hers for a long moment and then looked at Harper and said, "Thank you." In the direct, simple way she said things she meant entirely. Harper had said, "You're welcome," in the same register, and that had been enough. Nova, at 4 months old, was becoming a person with distinct preferences and the vocal capacity to express them. She had decided that Lila was the most interesting person in the household and tracked her around the kitchen with her eyes when Lila moved, which Lila received with a gravity that Harper found quietly moving. Not pride exactly, not the softness of sentimentality, but the serious acceptance of responsibility from someone who understood what responsibility actually meant. Jace had made Nova a small rattle from a piece of dowel and some dried beans in a tin, functionally ugly, structurally sound, exactly the kind of thing Jace made. And Nova had taken to it with an enthusiasm that was slightly disproportionate to its aesthetic qualities. There were still hard days, a cow that went off feed for a week and required twice daily monitoring that ate into everything else. A dispute with a neighboring rancher about the east fence line that required Calvin's involvement to navigate without escalating. A week in June, when the well produced murky water, and they couldn't figure out why, and Jace spent 3 days diagnosing the problem, which turned out to be a collapsed section of the casing that he repaired himself with materials from the hardware in Millhaven, and significant effort and some language Harper pretended she hadn't heard. There were disagreements. Jace had opinions about how the cattle should be rotated through the south pasture that differed from the way Harper had been doing it, and they argued about it for 2 days before Harper looked at his reasoning on paper and said, with some difficulty, that he was right. He had the grace not to belabor it. There were mornings when Lila was quiet in a way that wasn't her working quiet, but her gone somewhere quiet. And on those mornings, the house gave her room and Harper made sure there was something good at supper and didn't ask questions. There were nights when Harper lay awake and thought about Thomas and the ledger and the coin and the distance between where she'd been in November and where she was now, and the feeling that came with that accounting was complicated. Grief and relief and something harder to name. Something like the recognition that she had been more capable than she'd been allowed to be in that marriage, and that the loss and the difficulty had been the thing that proved it to her. She didn't feel good about that. She didn't feel bad about it either. She just felt the truth of it, the way you feel true things when you stop arguing with them. She thought, on those nights, about what this whole year had taught her about the way families actually form, not in ceremonies or paperwork or the neat narrative of blood and belonging, but in the accumulated weight of shared hard things. In the moment when someone puts a strip of oilcloth over a drafty window in a storm. In the moment when a 9-year-old tracks a feeding schedule nobody asked her to track. In the moment when a boy of 16 stands in a bedroom with a medical guide and a lantern and refuses to let his hand shake. You don't choose family by wanting to. You choose it by what you do when the cost is real. That was the thing she'd learned, or relearned, or finally learned properly. That love, the durable kind, the kind that means something, isn't the feeling. It's the behavior that persists after the feeling runs out. It's what you do at 3 in the morning when nobody is watching and there is nothing in it for you except the knowledge that something necessary is being done. Jace knew this. He had always known it, in his bones, the way you know things that were put there before you had words for them. Lila knew it differently, knew it the way quiet people know things, from the inside out, expressed not in declaration, but in the 10,000 small acts of attention that she brought to the people and animals in her care every single day. Nova would learn it. Harper was going to make sure of that, not by teaching it as a lesson, because the important things don't transfer that way, but by making sure it was what she saw around her. Every day, in the way the household ran, in the way its people treated each other when it was difficult, when they were tired, when they disagreed and had to find their way back to workable. In August, Harper stood in the yard in the early morning with Nova on her hip, the baby heavy and warm and inclined to grab whatever was within reach, which was currently Harper's braid, and watched Jace and Lila come back from the morning cattle check. They were talking about something as they came across the yard, some quiet disagreement from the look of it. Lila saying something, Jace shaking his head, Lila persisting in that way she had of persisting without raising her voice. Then Jace said something that made Lila look sideways at him, and after a moment nod, once, the way she nodded when she thought someone had made a fair point but wasn't going to be effusive about it. They walked like people who were used to each other, not identically. Jace's stride was longer, purposeful, covering ground because ground needed to be covered. Lila's was precise and considered, stepping around a soft patch of mud that Jace walked straight through, but together, without having to think about it. Harper looked at them, and at the barn with its solid corner, and at the pasture with its 14 head, and at the house with its properly caulked windows, and thought about the silver coin that had been sitting on the kitchen table in November, the one she'd picked up and put in her pocket before she drove to Millhaven in the dark. She still had it. It was in the top drawer of the kitchen dresser now, under the spare lamp wicks. She'd thought about spending it 100 times during the winter. There were always things it could have gone toward. She never had. She wasn't entirely sure why, except that some things you hold on to not for what they're worth, but for what they mark. The coin marked a morning when she had a choice between staying in a failing situation and doing something that scared her, and she had done the thing that scared her, and everything that had come from that, the whole complicated, difficult, real thing of it, had come from that. That seemed worth marking. Jace reached the yard and looked at her. He looked at Nova, who was occupied with the braid and not paying attention to much else. He looked at the cattle behind him, then back at Harper, the habitual morning report forming. 4 calves are all gaining weight, he said. The older Hereford cow is limping slightly on the right foreleg. I want to watch it. I'll look at her this afternoon, Harper said. I already did. It's not serious yet, just bears watching. All right. Lila had gone directly to the kitchen because something was always needed in the kitchen at this hour, and Lila had long since stopped waiting to be told what it was. Jace stood in the yard a moment longer. He looked like himself, which was to say, he looked like someone who was 17 in 2 months and would be a man before any of them were quite ready for it, with Thomas's old work coat that Harper had altered for his shoulders, and the brown paper notebook in his breast pocket, and the particular expression he wore on ordinary mornings, which was not quite at ease but close enough to count. Good morning, Harper said. He looked at her. Something moved in his face that was too small for most people to catch, and that she had spent 7 months learning to read. Morning, he said. He went inside. Harper stood in the yard for another moment with the sun coming up over the eastern hills and Nova pulling her braid with determined cheerfulness and the cattle moving slow and settled in the south pasture and the smell of something Lila was doing with the stove coming through the kitchen window, which was closed properly now and let through warmth and smell but not cold. She thought, this is not what I planned. She thought, this is not what I expected. She thought, finally, and without ceremony, this is what I have, and it is enough, and in ways that I did not know to plan for, it is more than enough. The ranch was not saved by a single decision or a single season. It was saved the way most things are actually saved, incrementally, imperfectly, by people who kept showing up on days when it would have been easier not to. by a 16-year-old who walked to North Ridge in winter to find out what they had, by a 9-year-old who tracked a feeding schedule and tended a fire through the night and said yes to things with her whole self when most adults her age would have learned already to say yes with only part of it, by a woman who drove 12 miles in the dark on icy roads because sitting still felt worse than being scared. None of them were what the other had expected. None of them were easy. None of them were finished. They were, all three of them. And Nova, who had not been asked her opinion but had arrived with the force of something that intended to be here, exactly what the other needed, in the particular form that need takes when it is honest about itself, which is the only form it can take and still be worth anything at all.